Now, let's go on to what I honestly think is a pretty important piece of news happening out of the Middle East, where the U.S. Navy has asked Australia to send warships, a ship, to the Red Sea to help defend against Iranian-backed militias who have been threatening shipping in the region. Now, this comes after a series of attacks and raids by Houthi rebels on Israeli and U.S. vessels operating in the vital sea lane, and also aiming attacks at Israel. Joining me now is senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Malcolm Davis. Malcolm, thank you so much for your time. I want to get into the broader ramifications of this request, but before we do, tell us what this would mean to our Navy if we were to agree to this request. Would that shift our force posture in any sort of way?
Hi, not really. It wouldn't, in the sense that we have done this sort of thing before, where we've deployed a warship into the Arabian Sea in support of US and coalition operations. So this would essentially be the same thing. And we've already got personnel deployed in the Middle East in support of US and other allied operations there now. So I don't see this as being a massive disruption to Australian Defence Force capabilities or anything like that.
But what about, though, this conflict that's happening, bringing in the Houthi rebels in Yemen? It's been an obscure conflict in the region for a long time, but it's become quite important now to what's happening between Israel and Gaza. These guys are backed by Iran, and there's this escalation that's happening with attacks on shipping. Tell us a bit more about that conflict and what Iran's role is in dialing this up.
Well, essentially, Iran supports the Houthis. They also support radical Palestinian and Islamic groups across Iraq and Syria. And these groups, as well as the Houthis, have been engaged in attacks right across the region, including against US forces in Iraq and Syria, as well as against commercial shipping in the Red Sea. And so what the Houthis are about is essentially imposing a cost on commercial shipping, driving up tensions. I think Iran is playing very much a grey zone game here, where it's trying to attack the US and get them to back down and inflict cost, but doing so at a level below that which would require a direct military response. And they're doing these constant attacks. And what you're seeing is the US respond with pinprick responses to these attacks. But those pinprick responses aren't really deterring the attacks from happening in the future. So you now have a situation where the Houthis have been attacking shipping in the Red Sea. That's interfering with maritime trade. And so the US is now being forced to consider a more robust response in the form of some sort of multinational maritime task force.
And how much control does Iran actually have over these rebels? I mean, is there the chance that they could go off and create an incident on their own, possibly by accident, that would then wind up widening this conflagration out of just Israel and Gaza to something much more dangerous?
Look, I think Iran has pretty tight control over the likes of Hezbollah and also the groups on the ground in Iraq and Syria. Maybe less control over the Houthis. But the Houthis do rely on Iran heavily for funding and weapons. So ultimately, Iran is pulling the strings here. And what the US needs to do is to basically impose some degree of cost on Iran itself in order to deter further attacks. The risk, of course, is in doing so, you could then see regional escalation of the war beyond Israel and Hamas in Gaza. So it is a challenging situation for the US. They can't just simply ignore these attacks. They can't ignore attacks on international shipping, but they have to respond in a way that avoids that wider regional war.
Yeah, Dr. Malcolm Davis, thanks for your time. This is, I think, absolutely one to watch in the weeks ahead.